Korea. I guess the reason why this topic kind of matters, I guess, is that a lot of times when people think of like Christianity's impact on Korean society, Protestantism gets most of the credit, and I guess Protestantism probably did actually do more than Catholicism did, but Catholicism still laid the groundwork that Protestantism built on. So I'm going to, first before I talk about Catholicism's impact, I'm going to talk about some people and sort of the background, how Catholicism spread in Korea. So this guy here, he was the firstborn Korean Catholic priest. His name was Kim Tae-gun, and yeah, he's the man, I guess. He was killed for his beliefs later. So basically, the way Catholicism spread through Korea was without any missionaries. And what happened was, during the late Joseon period, there was a group of scholars who were getting kind of sick of like the Neo-Confucianism. They felt like there was a disconnect between the Confucianism of the time and the actual problems that people were facing. And so they were looking for new answers to the problems that they had. And what they came up with was this new way of learning called Shihak. That means practical learning. And they were kind of opposed to the uncritical following of Confucian ideas. And like I said before, they felt like it wasn't connecting with real problems. It was too focused on rituals and traditions. And so what these Shihak scholars called for were reforms in agriculture, industry, politics, things that were actually affecting people's lives. And so that's what their focus was on. This guy here in the pictures, he was also a Shihak scholar and one of the first Korean Catholics. He was exiled for his beliefs. He wasn't killed, luckily, because he ended up denouncing his beliefs in Catholicism. And kind of when Catholicism first came to Korea, it came along with other Western things. Basically, I think Dr. Peterson's talked about the tribute missions that Korea would go on to China. And sometimes what they would come back with were Western books and things like that that China had. And some of those books were medical and science textbooks, and along with that was Catholic literature and things like that. And it was all kind of just lumped into this term called Sohak, or Western learning. And so it was sort of Korea's first interaction with Western science, technology, Western-style logic and reasoning and things like that. And some of these Sohak scholars took a liking to Christianity, and some of them eventually ended up converting as well. And so that's kind of, Christianity spread through them to the common people without any missionaries. When the first missionaries from Europe came to Korea, there were already thousands of Korean Catholics who were practicing Catholicism at the time. So it's kind of interesting, because I don't think there are too many other countries that just kind of adopted a religion without it being taught by missionaries who believed in that religion. One of the reasons why Christianity appealed to these scholars was, one, like I said before, they felt like it answered some of the problems that they were facing. It was more based on, everyday things, and they also really liked the egalitarian views that it had. People were getting kind of tired of the Confucian social hierarchy and things like that, and they saw Catholicism and Western learning as a new source of learning and social change. Another thing that kind of helped it to be more acceptable to people was that it did have some parallels to ideas that they already had, like Buddhism and Confucianism. I think somebody else mentioned in one of their presentations on Confucianism, something that Confucius and Jesus both taught similar things, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and things like that. And Buddhism and Catholicism both shared I could do a presentation on the similarities between Catholicism and Buddhism as well. And I've got just artistic similarities, there's things like that, and then both Catholicism and Buddhism were influenced by Greco-Roman ideas from the Silk Road, and then Christianity in Europe and things like that. So those things helped, bring appeal to Catholicism in Korea. Some notable early Catholics in Korea, there was a guy named Lee Byuk, who was one of the first major leaders. He helped to organize basically the first Catholic community in Seoul. He was like, when the first missionaries, a lot of them were French missionaries who came to Korea, they found that there were all these little pockets of Catholic communities who had lay leaders. So these guys hadn't been ordained to the priesthood or anything like that, but they were leading Catholic groups. So this Lee Byuk guy was one of the first ones. He was put under house arrest for his beliefs. He ended up denouncing Catholicism and died in 1785 of the plague. And this guy right here, I think, is Lee Sung-hoon was one of the first converts to Catholicism in Korea. So he, like, I think he went to China and was baptized there. This picture down here is him being confirmed a member of the Catholic Church, I think. He went and partook of the Catholic sacraments or whatever in China. He was killed for his beliefs in 1801. Chung Yak-dong was also, he was a really important guy because what he did was he was one of those Sohag scholars. He was a Confucian scholar to begin with, and he got a hold of these Catholic texts, and he was so moved by the concepts of Catholicism that he believed that everybody should have access to these. And so he was one of the first scholars to really seriously use Hangul in Korea, the Korean, I guess, alphabet. And before then, it hadn't been used a lot in scholarly works and things like that, but Catholicism, I'll talk more about that later, they really utilized Hangul to spread the gospel to commoners. And his son, Tung Ha-sang, or St. Paul, he's a canonized Catholic saint now, and he died in 1833. He was killed during a Catholic purge, but what he was known for doing was, so before his time, Korea had for a very short period of time, had a priest who was from Europe, who had been living in China and came down. I think he was killed. And what Ha-sang did was he went with the tribute mission several times to China to talk to the Catholic leaders who were in China to try and bring a priest to Korea, and eventually he was successful in doing that, and he was also very instrumental in establishing the first Catholic diocese in Korea, so he was really important, and he was canonized, I think, in 1988 by the Pope as a Catholic saint. And as you may have noticed, a lot of these guys were all killed for their beliefs or exiled or things like that, put under house arrest. And one of the reasons why there's so many persecution was that Catholics refused to participate in ancestor worship. One of the first big persecutions was in 1791, and the reason for that was because some of the Catholics had burned their Confucian ancestor tablets because they refused to worship their ancestors, and this really pissed off the Confucian scholars. They were mad about that, and so in 1791 there was a big purge of Catholics. I think during that purge there wasn't as many people who were killed. I think a few people were put under house arrest and things like that, but it got more and more serious because Catholics they thought that the king was a man. They believed that everybody is created equal in the image of God, and so that they thought that the king was, judged by God just like anyone else. He was nothing special, and the Confucian scholars thought that this was disloyal and dangerous to the stability of the government. And then the 1801 persecution was when it started to get really violent, and what happened with that was there were government intrigues in the court. The Queen Dowager had an opposing group of scholars that she hated, and a lot of them were Catholic, and so she used Catholicism as sort of the scapegoat to take out the opposition in the court, and so it led to a big purge. And in the end, during all these different persecutions, there were over 10,000 martyrs in Korea, and 103 of these martyrs are canonized saints today. I think I read somewhere that Korea has the 4th largest number of Catholic saints out of any country, so that's pretty crazy because you don't think of like Asia as being this super Christian region, but in Korea it was a pretty big deal, especially during the late Joseon period. So now, So now I'm going to talk more about the impact that that Catholicism had on Korea. One of the first ones was literacy. Like I talked about, a lot of these early Catholic texts were translated into Hangul for the benefit of everybody, and so this was one of the earliest major widespread uses of Hangul by people who both were scholars and non-scholars, and women and children were a lot of times used to help transcribe these religious texts. So when people would get a hold of maybe a portion of the Bible or things like that, they'd copy it down and distribute it to everybody. And a lot of times women and children were used to do that. This French missionary, when he came to Korea in the mid-1800s, he basically said that it would be a good idea for all children to learn to read and write. And this was a big deal too because before then, a lot, especially Confucian-style learning, had mostly been restricted for men, but this was the first time you had sort of men and women having an opportunity to at least have a chance at literacy and things like that. And then the first translation of the Bible was also done into Hangul by Catholic missionaries. Another big one was that Catholicism set up some of the first educational institutions in Korea. So before that, there was just these Confucian places that you could go to learn and things like that. But the Catholics started universities and stuff. One of the first universities in Korea was established in 1855. It was the Catholic University of Korea. And that university today, it has its medical school is the third best medical school, the third most prestigious medical school in Korea. And they also set up many primary schools throughout the country for children to learn to read and write, especially read and write scriptures and things like that. But yeah, and like I mentioned before, it gave equality of education to both boys and girls. So that was kind of a first in Korea. Healthcare was also largely influenced. A lot of the first hospitals in Korea were built by Catholics. Not the first hospital in Korea was actually built by Protestants, but a lot of the early ones were established by Catholics. And like I said before too, Western science and medicine were first introduced along with Catholicism. They're kind of seen as one and the same. And then, yeah, like I said, the Seoul St. Mary's Hospital is affiliated with that Catholic university in Seoul. And then I think the biggest thing that it helped to do was it started the beginning of a lot of different social changes, not just in education, but just overall gender equality and social freedom for women. Catholicism, like I said, and Christianity in general regards all humans as children of God created in His image, and so that helps the Christians in Korea to give equality to women and more understanding than Confucianism had done in the past. It also allowed property to be held by individuals instead of the head of the family. So if you had something, you didn't have to give it to your parents, it was yours, you got what you worked for. It also resisted the concubine system and the polygamy that was going on in Korea at the time. And sometimes a lot of women were neglected, so people would have secondary wives and concubines that they would marry for political reasons, and then they'd just leave them in a house and just keep them locked up in there and never talk to them again. And the Catholics and Christians resisted that system. They thought that was messed up. And then also just the Neo-Confucian emphasis on having daughters and things like that, that was also looked down on, and arranged child marriages were prohibited. And so yeah, it brought a lot of gender equality and things that hadn't been seen. And I mean, these changes happened slowly. It's not like Catholicism came and all of a sudden women had all these rights and things like that. This was a really small community of Catholics, and it grew slowly over time. So, and that's the end of my presentation. I just